Thesis, please?
Let me preface this video by stating that no one has to watch anything beyond the original 6 Star Wars movies to understand Star Wars. The Lucas saga is perfectly fine without the Clone Wars, without Rogue One and Andor. And the Clone Wars, Rogue One and Andor are remarkable works in their own right. We don't watch them so they could somehow improve the movies. One ought to regard them as independent stories too. Nevertheless, the fantastic synergy with the original trilogy present in Andor is one of its greatest accomplishments. This accomplishment manifests itself in many different ways throughout the show, yet in each of those we see a strong respect for the original trilogy and a strong desire to lift it.
And I yearn to lift you.
That's what I like to talk about here. Let's start with the way Andor portrays the rebellion and the rebels' motives in contrast with the original trilogy. Andor manages to make the struggle between the two opposing factions look more entertaining in the period before the rebel militaries ally with each other by showing what the war actually means to those who fight it. The original trilogy glossed over the motivations of those who fight the war. Although the battles were most spectacular, we only see the soldiers who have already enlisted, but not why they are willing to stand up to the Empire.
Right now I feel I can take on the whole Empire myself.
Especially in the last two movies. Apart from the Empire making itself comfortable on its own terms on Cloud City and Endor, there is no justification for military opposition to the Empire beyond just saying the Empire is bad. A New Hope does all the heavy lifting in this case. It very clearly establishes Luke and Leia's motivations on screen. In Rogue One we got to see the Erso family's perspective, but in Andor we got to see a lot more. The oppressive occupations of Ferrix, of Aldhani, unfair detentions and trials, as well as the inhumane slave labor prisons, the Orwellian police state spying on Imperial citizens, etc. Andor leaves no room for doubting why exactly someone in the galaxy would want to enlist in the rebel military to fight the Empire. Andor makes the war matter. Andor would not fit in the Clone Wars because that war was meaningless. It does a service to the original trilogy by staying true to what makes it different from the prequel trilogy. Another example is a lack of Jedi during this era. It's up to regular people to make a difference. Speaking of doing a service to the original trilogy, let's get to the next point, about how well Andor builds up the threat of the Death Star. It's clear that in Lucas's saga, Palpatine had planned two big finishing moves in order to secure his hold on the galaxy. The first one is Order 66, the elimination of the greatest threat to his takeover of the Republic, though the Clone Wars series handles that well. The second one is the implementation of the Death Star to subdue all living beings. So what of Andor?
I'm just a tourist.
Does him and his inmates making those small cogs really build up the threat of the Death Star? No, it's subtler than that. To understand how subtly Andor does it, let's examine the political situation presented to us in A New Hope.
The Imperial Senate will not sit still for this.
It was not as overt as the one in the prequel trilogy, but it's still significant. In A New Hope, the Imperial Senate, the last remnant of the old Republic system, still existed many years after the Emperor took over. Despite it being a stage for all Imperial systems to share their discontent, Palpatine had intentionally kept the Imperial Senate around.
I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently.
He does not dissolve the Senate before the Death Star, lest the unrepresented systems easily secede.
That's impossible. How will the Emperor maintain control without the bureaucracy?
And only does it when the Death Star becomes available.
Fear will keep the local systems in line. Fear of this battle station.
That speaks a lot about the Death Star's significance to Palpatine. It was a dangerous game because the Senate did have some power to oppose the Emperor. Low and high-level Imperial officials alike worry about it on screen.
Word of this gets out, it could generate sympathy for the rebellion in the Senate.
The rebellion will continue to gain a support in the Imperial Senate.
Rogue One also highlights this issue many times.
If the Senate gets wind of our project, countless systems will flock to the rebellion.
When the battle station is finished, Governor Tarkin, the Senate will be of little concern.
But the Senate did not use the power it had. How does Andor factor into this? By showing why exactly the senators gave up that power. Andor depicts this by heavily involving Mon Mothma in the story. Mon Mothma, the only character from the 6 movies apart from Colonel Yularen who appears in Season 1, doesn't even cross paths with Cassian. Why is she here instead of Jabba, Lando Calrissian, Boba Fett or Darth Vader? Her presence, alongside everyone else's absence, indicates a particular focus in Andor's narrative. In this otherwise bottom-up narrative, there's one prominent top-down perspective to show us how the Senate really works. Mon is outspoken about the atrocities against the Gormans and Empire overreach. Yet she feels helpless in her job because most other senators aren't there to support her defiance.
The Emperor's primary charge is to protect us.
If you're doing nothing wrong, what is there to fear?
I'm fearing your definition of wrong.
As Luthen says, the Empire is choking us so slowly we're starting not to notice. A few outspoken senators are enough to make Imperial officials cautious. But so long as the apathetic senators make up the majority, the Empire wins. The senators could have fought off Palpatine's influence had they been united in defiance. They didn't, and when the Death Star became operational, it was too late to object. They missed their chance, and the Empire no longer needed to be cautious. The moral, as a result, is that they instead chose to degrade, slowly giving up their power and voice. Andor shows the delicate puppeteering Palpatine employed so his second finishing move could be successful. It almost was.
We have no recourse but to surrender.
But it all fell apart. After the Death Star was destroyed, the galaxy that should have been cowering in fear had nothing to fear anymore. On the contrary, the collective anger at the destruction of Alderaan united the peoples against the Emperor, and there was no bureaucracy left to shade him. His eventual downfall began with his futile overcommitment to the Death Star. I love Andor for getting this point across so wonderfully. To underscore that point, it even makes a miniature version of the exact opposite story on Ferrix. A big funeral was a common tradition on Ferrix before the Empire. After they took over, their first instinct was to shut it down.
They'll ask for a permit. They know we won't allow it, but they like to keep asking.
But Dedra's goal was to capture Axis and end rebellion outright.
We want a funeral.
Thus she allowed the big gathering to happen, not expecting it to turn into a disaster. The citizens of Ferrix showed what could have happened had the senators been as united in defiance as them. A total disaster for the Empire. Andor finally makes the Empire look threatening. All the evils in the galaxy are no longer exclusive to Palpatine. He doesn't even appear in this one, just like he didn't appear in A New Hope. The lack of Palpatine or Vader in Andor is more dreadful than their presence would be. Big Brother is watching you, but he doesn't exist. He's not the one who oppresses you. Your own people are the ones you should be wary of.
Who is it? Who is it?
The main hand of the Empire in Andor is neither the army nor the navy. It's the Imperial Security Bureau, the Gestapo, the KGB of Star Wars. They don't brute force their way to victory. In cases such as Anto Krieger, their subtlety pays off. The way they handled that situation was brilliant. There was so much talk of Anto Krieger throughout the season.
Krieger's a separatist.
But the ISB disposed of him off-screen like a pest, and the ISB got onto that track after torturing Bix Caleen. Truly scary how thorough and fruitful their work can be. I'd like to take a moment to highlight the way Stormtroopers are portrayed in Andor. What do we know of Stormtroopers in the original trilogy? Were they the bumbling idiots they are perceived to be in pop culture? They couldn't hit their targets on the Death Star because they were explicitly ordered not to.
They let us go.
This had better work.
They lost the teddy bears on Andor because it was Lucas's way of portraying the asymmetrical warfare of Vietnam. Thus, we have two overblown cases in which they look bad, but both are explained by the plot. Then we have their performance on Tantive 4 and Tatooine, then on Hoth and Bespin. They are competent in those, especially when they don't have to deal with any Jedi. Obi-Wan himself claims that the Stormtroopers are known for hitting their targets.
Only Imperial Stormtroopers are so precise.
How he learned that, I don't know. He never left Tatooine, but his words are true nonetheless. Stormtroopers in Andor are terrifying, because once again, we're looking at them from the bottom-up perspective. Even though admittedly, it wouldn't be hard to shoot down an unarmed citizen, their presence works as a symbol of tight control on a thematic level. In the original trilogy and Rogue One, we are dealing with big players on important planets. By the nature of that kind of storytelling, we got to see a lot of Stormtroopers, even though they were never explicitly stated to make up the Imperial Army in the same way Clone Troopers made up the Republic Army. Stormtroopers are supposed to be rarer than Clone Troopers, and we got that in Andor. Look at all these army troopers on Aldhani. This is a backwater planet that doesn't need any Stormtrooper presence. Only when ISB pursues a particular goal do we get to see them on Ferrix. Even then, the ratio of Stormtroopers to army troopers is very low. As a result, the value and threat of Stormtroopers went up a great deal. Andor elevated the Stormtroopers' role in the original trilogy much better than Rebels or The Mandalorian ever could.
Former Imperial sharpshooter.
That's not saying much.
I wasn't a Stormtrooper, wise ass.
We belong here. We're following
He was a Stormtrooper.
The
doors being opened as we approach.
Really?
Lieutenant Gorn will be out front. He's the leader. He's the gatekeeper. Pick it up!
Andor is definitely my second most favorite Star Wars show now. The Clone Wars still remains the first. Earlier in the 2 finishing moves section, I noted a similarity in how they built up to the events in the movies. The similarities don't end there, but that warrants a separate video. This should be enough for now. As always, like, share and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Oh, and also, I've seen a lot of praise going towards the performances of Andy Serkis and Stellan Skarsgård, but not a lot for Genevieve O'Reilly, who happens to be my favorite performance in the whole show, so that's what I'm saying here. Peace.
Smile.